The text came in at 2:47 inches the morning. Not a call, a text. 3 words. Dad, help me. I stared at my phone in the dark for maybe 2 seconds. Then I was already reaching for my pants. My wife stirred behind me. Frank, what is it? It's Claire, I said. That was all I said, because that was all I needed to say. My wife had been waiting for something like this for 2 years. We both had. You don't watch your daughter disappear slowly into a man like Daniel Marsh and not spend every night with one ear open. I didn't call the police. I want to be honest about that right from the start, because I know what some people will say. I know how it looks. But I had called the police before. 8 months earlier, when Claire showed up at our door with a bruise along her jaw that she said came from walking into a cabinet door in the kitchen. I called the non-emergency line. I spoke to a very polite officer who told me that my daughter was an adult, that she had not filed any complaint, and that there was nothing they could do unless she asked for help herself. He was sympathetic. He genuinely seemed like a decent man, and he sent me away with nothing. So at 2:47 inches the morning, I didn't call the police. I grabbed my keys, kissed my wife on the forehead, and I drove. Claire and Daniel lived 40 minutes from us, out past the edge of town where the subdivisions were newer and the lawns were bigger, and everyone drove the same 3 models of SUV. I had been to their house maybe a dozen times in 2 years of marriage. Daniel was always gracious when I visited, offered me a beer, asked about my golf game, laughed at my jokes. He was the kind of man who knew exactly how to behave in front of the people who mattered. That was the first thing I should have understood about him. Men who are always perfectly charming in public are sometimes saving something for when the doors close. I tried to call Claire 3 times on the drive over. Straight to voicemail every time. I tried texting back. Nothing. I pulled into their street at 3:22 inches the morning. The neighborhood was dark and quiet. One of those streets where every house looks like every other house, and everyone is very careful to keep it that way. Claire's house, I still couldn't think of it as Daniel's house, or their house. It was always Claire's house. In my mind had every light off except for one upstairs window. The bedroom, I thought. I sat in my truck for 30 seconds and I made myself think clearly. I was 63 years old. I had a bad knee and a heart that my doctor monitored with more attention than I was comfortable with. I was not going to kick any doors in. I was not going to put my hands on anyone. What I was going to do was ring the doorbell and ask to see my daughter. And if that didn't work, I was going to call an attorney I had been quietly keeping the number for in my phone for the better part of a year. I rang the doorbell. Nothing for a long moment. Then a light came on in the entryway, and the door opened, and there was Daniel. He was in pajamas. His hair was messed from sleep. But his eyes were completely awake, and the expression on his face when he saw me was not surprise. It was something closer to irritation. "Frank," he said, "it's 3 in the morning. I got a text from Claire. She needs help. Claire is fine. She's sleeping. I'd like to see that for myself." He leaned against the doorframe in a way that was meant to look casual, but was actually meant to fill the space. "I understand you're worried, but you can't just show up at people's houses in the middle of the night because you had a bad feeling. Claire is my wife. She's my responsibility. She's sleeping." She texted me, "Daniel." 3 words. "Dad, help me." That's not a bad feeling. That's my daughter asking for help. Something moved behind his eyes. She has anxiety. You know that. She sometimes gets confused at night, especially if she's had her medication. She probably doesn't even remember sending that. That word, medication. It landed on me like something cold. "What medication?" I said. He smiled at me. "Patient. Practiced. Her anxiety medication. Frank, I really think it's best if you go home. I'll have her call you in the morning. We can all have breakfast together. How does that sound?" And then he started to close the door. I put my hand on it. "I'm not leaving until I see my daughter." He looked at my hand on his door. Then he looked at me, and the patient smile stayed exactly in place, but something underneath it went very still and very cold. "If you don't remove your hand from my door," he said, quietly, "I'm going to call the police and tell them you came to my home in the middle of the night threatening me, and you will never see Claire again." I believed him. I want to be honest about that too. Standing there at 3:22 inches the morning, I believed every word he said. Because this was the thing about Daniel Marsh that I had spent 2 years slowly understanding. He was not a man who made empty threats. He was a man who planned things. He was a man who thought about contingencies and prepared for them ahead of time. He had been preparing for this moment, I realized, for a long time. I took my hand off the door. He closed it. I stood on the front step and I listened to the deadbolt turn, and I felt something I had not felt since my own father passed away, which was a specific kind of helpless grief, the feeling of being on the outside of something you cannot break through by force of will alone. Then I walked back to my truck and I sat in the dark, and I called the number in my phone. Margaret Holloway answered on the fourth ring, and to her credit, she did not sound annoyed at being called at 3:30 in the morning. Margaret was a family law attorney. I had been referred to by a friend of mine whose son had gone through a difficult divorce. I had called her 8 months ago, after the bruised jaw incident, and we had spoken for 40 minutes. She had told me the things I could do and the things I couldn't do and the things I would need before anything could move forward. I had been quietly gathering some of those things since then. "Frank Calloway," she said, "talk to me." I told her everything. The text, Daniel at the door, the medication comment. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Don't go back to the door tonight," she said. "Go home. I need to make 2 phone calls. I'll call you back in an hour. Margaret, my daughter. I understand. Go home. An hour." I drove home. My wife was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee, waiting. I sat down across from her and I told her what had happened, and she listened the way she had always listened, which was completely, without offering comfort she didn't mean. When I finished, she reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "Margaret knows what she's doing," she said. "I should have. You did exactly right. You kept your head. That matters now." She was right. I knew she was right. But knowing something and feeling it are 2 different things. And for the next 55 minutes I sat at that kitchen table and I felt every one of them. Margaret called back at 4:41. "Okay," she said. "Here's what I found out, and here's what we're going to do." What she had found out was this. 2 weeks earlier, Daniel Marsh had taken Claire to a private psychiatric facility called Hargrove Wellness Center, 40 miles north of their house. He had had her admitted on a voluntary basis. Her signature was on the paperwork, though Margaret had questions about the circumstances under which that signature had been obtained. The facility had a policy of limiting outside contact for the first 30 days of a stay to reduce environmental stressors. Daniel Marsh had designated himself as Claire's primary contact and point of decision-making authority during her treatment. He had not told us. In 2 weeks, he had not said a single word to me or to my wife about where our daughter was. The text, Margaret believed, had come from a phone Claire had kept hidden. A backup phone, a burner, something, which meant she was not confused. She was not medicated into a fog. She was lucid enough to have planned for the possibility that she might need to reach out in a way that Daniel couldn't control. My daughter had been planning her escape for longer than I had realized. "Can I go get her?" I asked. "Not yet. If you walk into that facility and demand they release her, they will call security, and Daniel will use it to paint you as unstable and aggressive. That hurts us. What we're doing instead is filing an emergency motion this morning on the grounds that the voluntary admission may not have been truly voluntary. I have a colleague who works in this area and owes me a favor. We're also going to be talking to someone at Adult Protective Services by 9 o'clock. What do I do until then? You let me work. I have spent a lot of my life being a man who handled things himself. I grew up in a household where you fixed your own car and you built your own shelves, and you did not ask for help unless you had already tried and failed 3 times on your own. That mentality had served me in most areas of my life, and it had served me poorly in this one, because I had spent 2 years trying to handle something that required a different set of tools than the ones I had. I let Margaret work. At 8:15 that morning, I was sitting in her office in a building downtown that smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner, and she was across the desk from me looking like a woman who had been awake all night and was energized by it rather than diminished. "The admission paperwork has some problems," she said. Claire signed on a form that listed her primary diagnosis as acute anxiety disorder with psychotic features. That's a specific designation that requires a specific evaluation process. The evaluation was conducted by a Dr. Philip Reese, who is, interestingly, a personal friend of Daniel Marsh's family. They went to college together. I looked at her. That's a conflict of interest, I said. That is very much a conflict of interest. It doesn't automatically invalidate the admission, but it gives us significant grounds for challenge. She folded her hands on the desk. There's more. The facility itself is operating under a provisional license that was under review as of 3 months ago following a complaint from a former patient's family. They are not in a position to invite scrutiny right now, which means they are going to be considerably more cooperative than they might otherwise be. I thought about Daniel standing in his doorway at 3 in the morning, patient and prepared. I thought about how long he must have been planning this, and underneath the anger, I felt something else, which was a kind of exhausted admiration for my daughter, who had seen what was coming and had quietly prepared a lifeline of her own. When can I see her? I asked. This afternoon, Margaret said. I'm filing this morning. By noon, Daniel Marsh is going to have some very uncomfortable questions to answer, and by 2 o'clock, we will have a court-authorized welfare check at that facility. She was right on all 3 counts. At 11:48, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was a photo, a screenshot of a legal filing notification. The message with it said only, "He knows. Be careful." It was from Claire. At 12:15, Margaret called me to tell me that Daniel Marsh had contacted her office through his own attorney and offered to consent to a voluntary family visit, framing it as his idea, as a gesture of goodwill. He's trying to get ahead of it, she said. Let him think he did, I said. I drove to Hargrove Wellness Center with my wife in the passenger seat and Margaret's associate, a young man named Patrick, who wore a suit that was slightly too large for him and had the focused, careful energy of someone who had been very poor as a child and intended to stay poor for not one more day, riding in the back seat with a leather folder on his knee. The facility was a converted estate property, the kind of place that looked like a spa from the outside. There was a fountain at the entrance and manicured hedges and a sign in tasteful lettering that said nothing about what went on inside. The administrator who met us in the lobby was a woman in her 50s named Carol, who had the smooth, professional composure of someone who was very good at her job and was also, today, scared. Patrick handed her a document. She read it twice. Then she excused herself for 4 minutes, and when she came back, the composure had been adjusted slightly, like a picture frame straightened on a wall. Of course, she said. I'll have someone bring her down. I don't know what I expected. In my mind, on the drive over, I had been imagining Claire pale and diminished, confused by whatever they had been giving her. I think I had been imagining the worst, because the worst was what I'd been quietly dreading for 2 years. She came around the corner in jeans and a sweater, her hair down, carrying a small book under her arm. She looked tired. She looked thinner than the last time I'd seen her. But her eyes were completely clear, and when she saw me, she walked faster, and I had my arms around her before either of us said a single word. She cried. I didn't, but only barely. I didn't know if the text went through, she said into my shoulder. It went through, I said. My wife had her hand on Claire's back. My wife, who had been steady and practical through all of this, was not steady at this moment, and I loved her more in that instant than I had words for. We sat in a room that was furnished to look comfortable upholstered chairs, a low table, a window looking out at the hedges, and Claire talked for a long time. She talked about the last 2 years in a way she had never been able to talk before. Not to us, maybe not to anyone. The slow process of being made small. The way Daniel controlled the finances, the social calendar, who she spoke to and when and how often. The medication, which had started as something she'd been told she needed and had gradually become something she wasn't sure about. Prescribed by a doctor she'd had no part in choosing. 2 weeks ago, he told me we were going on a drive, she said. He wouldn't tell me where. When we got here, there was paperwork. He sat right next to me while I signed it. I didn't know, I was signing, so I thought. She stopped. I know how that sounds. It doesn't sound like anything except what it was, Patrick said quietly. He had a notepad on his knee and had been writing steadily. Claire looked at him. Then she looked at me. I kept the second phone in my shoe, she said. I've had it for 4 months. I didn't know if he checked my regular phone. I wasn't sure. I wanted to have something. 4 months. My daughter had been quietly preparing her exit strategy for 4 months, carrying a phone in her shoe, waiting for the right moment, doing what she needed to do to survive until she could get clear. I thought of her as a little girl, 9 years old, who had spent 2 weeks one summer teaching herself to ride a bike with no hands because someone at school had said she couldn't do it. I had forgotten until that moment, sitting in that room, watching my adult daughter hold her cup of tea with both hands and tell her story in a clear, steady voice. She had always been braver than she looked. We left the facility at 4:30. Claire was coming home with us. Margaret had filed the appropriate paperwork, and the facility, facing its own licensing review and a conflict of interest problem with Dr. Reese, did not put up a fight. Daniel Marsh's attorney had called twice during the afternoon. Margaret's office had responded both times in writing. Don't communicate with him directly, Margaret told Claire on the phone that evening. Not by text, not by call, not through friends. Everything goes through me. There was a period after that, which was not easy. I want to be honest about that too, because these stories sometimes end with the bad man punished, and the door closed, and everyone walking off into their regular life without limping. And that is not how it went for us. Claire stayed in our house for 6 weeks. She had nightmares, not every night, but often enough. She had a therapist she spoke to twice a week, a woman she had found herself, which felt important to her. There were days when she was matter-of-fact and practical, and there were days when she sat in the backyard in her mother's garden chair and stared at things I couldn't see. I learned to read the difference between the days when she wanted company and the days when she needed to be left alone, which is something I had never been particularly good at before and became, during those 6 weeks, a skill I worked at deliberately. Daniel Marsh hired the kind of attorney that tells you something about a person, the kind that immediately seeks to discredit the other party by any available means. There was an attempt to introduce evidence that Claire had a history of instability. There was a suggestion, through his attorney, that my interference had been inappropriate and possibly criminal. There was a period of 3 weeks during which I received 2 calls from private numbers at odd hours, never with anyone on the other end, when I answered. I wrote down the dates and times and told Margaret. Margaret had discovered, by this point, several other things. She had discovered that Daniel Marsh had transferred a significant amount of money from a joint account into an account Claire had no access to, the week before the drive to Hargrove. She had discovered that the house Claire had brought into the marriage, the house her grandmother had left her, had been quietly retitled in a process that a forensic accountant Margaret brought in described, in a deposition, as structured to obscure the beneficial ownership. She had discovered that Dr. Philip Reese had lost his hospital privileges at 2 separate facilities in the previous decade for reasons that the records described in careful, non-specific language. Each of these discoveries was a stone. Margaret was very patient about placing them. By the time the divorce proceedings were fully underway, Daniel Marsh was not in the confident position he had been in at 3 o'clock in the morning on that doorstep. He had an attorney who was charging him by the hour for a case that was growing more complicated each week. He had a licensing board inquiry into Dr. Reese that had his name adjacent to it in ways he had not anticipated. He had adult protective services documentation that had been entered into the family court record. He had a forensic accountant's deposition. He had, in short, the sustained and organized attention of people who were better at this than he was. The house was returned. Not immediately, not without cost, not without a process that took months and required more patience than I knew I had in me. But it was returned. The money that had been moved was accounted for. A judge used the phrase deliberate financial concealment in a written ruling, and Margaret texted me a photo of the paragraph with no comment, which was its own kind of comment. There was an evening, maybe 4 months after all of it started, when Claire came by for dinner on a night that wasn't planned. She came through the back door the way she had when she was a teenager, letting herself in without knocking, which she had stopped doing at some point during her marriage and which I hadn't realized I missed until she was doing it again. She helped her mother set the table. We ate pasta that my wife makes with sausage and fennel and a green salad and bread from the bakery 2 blocks from our house. After dinner, we sat on the back porch in the cooling dark, and Claire told us she had been offered a position with a design firm in the city. She had a degree she hadn't used. She had been telling herself for 2 years that she was too out of practice, too far behind, that the field had passed her by. Her therapist had apparently spent considerable time on this particular story Claire was telling herself. "I'm going to take it," she said. "Of course you are," my wife said. We sat for a while after that without talking, the three of us. The kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. I thought about what I had done right and what I had done wrong in the preceding 2 years. I had not moved fast enough. I had given too much benefit of the doubt to a man I knew, in my stomach, deserved none. I had waited for Claire to ask for help when I should have been making it easier for her to ask. I had tried to handle things myself, when the situation required lawyers and systems and people who understood those systems. What I had done right was pick up the phone at 2:47 inches the morning and immediately believe my daughter. That was the thing. Out of everything, that was the most important thing, and it was also the simplest. When your child reaches out to you in the dark, whatever age they are, whatever complicated history is between you, you believe them. You don't ask whether it makes sense. You don't wait for a better time. You get in your truck and you drive. And then, when you get there and find that the problem is bigger than you can fix, with your own 2 hands, and sometimes the problem is always going to be bigger than that, you pick up the phone and you call Margaret Holloway. That's the part I wish I had understood earlier. The part that could have saved us both a year or two. But we were here now. My daughter was going to take the job. The evening was warm, and the yard smelled like the roses my wife had been coaxing along the back fence for a decade. And Claire had her bare feet up on the porch, railing the way she used to when she was 17. And everything that needed to be said had been said, which meant everything was, for tonight, enough.